Is this on? Can everybody hear me? All right. I appreciate you guys all being here tonight, and it's a real honor to get to come out here to the Clinton Foundation and to address you guys. I really appreciate it. I'm going to be talking tonight about the science of violence and compassion and the idea of preventing violence through research and education. The talk's a pretty simple form. I'm going to first introduce my favorite organ, the brain, lead into introductions to myself in a few different ways, the idea of violence and its role coming from brain health. Then we're going to get into the meat of it, introducing a model or a paradigm of violence and compassion, talking about risk factors and protective factors. And then I'm going to conclude with the idea that in order to be human, really relies on our ability to be humane. Right? So without further ado, the brain. We can look at the human body, and we all know, we have these organs that have specific functions. We know the heart pumps the blood through us. We have the liver, the kidneys, the stomach. We all understand what they do and their critical need. We also recognize that we have a brain, and that's necessary to kind of coordinate and run all of these things. But when I tell people that brain science is entirely unexplored, it really surprises people, and I don't think that people understand the extent to which we're ignorant about our brains. Brain science is the least explored of all of our sciences, bar none. We know more about the bottoms of the oceans, we know more about the surface of Mars, we know more about subatomic particle structures than we do what's between our ears. And one of our 15-year-old interns put it really best when she said, considering that this is the organ we used to consider, it's really ironic how little we know about it. The brain is housed inside of our skulls. You can't take it out and put it back and have the dude be in the same shape as when you started. And you can't look at it and gather what it does by just visually looking at it. So as a result, we think of ourselves in sort of a dualist way. Here's our meat, and this is the functions that they serve, but I'm out here somewhere. Ethereal, it's kind of mystical, a little bit magical. But we have to recognize that our behaviors come from this organ, the brain. There's nothing else out there. There's no strings attached. We are responsible for taking care of these actions through taking care of this organ, the brain. So while it is just another organ, we know a lot less about it and need to fill some puzzle pieces in compared to the other organs. Okay, so let me introduce myself and why I'm here. I'm a neuroscientist. I got into neuroscience because I was touched at a very young age by a grandfather that had Alzheimer's disease. How many of you here have been touched by that disease in some way or another? Yeah, almost everybody. What I really quickly learned when my grandfather suffered from this was that it's a lot more than just I can't remember things disease. I was profoundly moved by the fact that who we are, all the way down to our core, our entire essence, really our personalities rely on the proper functioning of this organ. And if it doesn't work right, we don't act right either. And so that moved me to study neuroscience and how the brain works. And in those days, we didn't have undergraduate degrees in neuroscience. And I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study. So I would go door to door, knocking on the labs in the hospital area and ask them, can I wash your dishes? Can I do anything? I just need to get into a lab. And eventually, after washing dishes for a while, I got to doing experiments and tinkering around. And finally, one day, I was given the chance and I started studying Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia. Then I moved into studying pain modulation and eventually obesity, and I took off from there. And the only reason I highlight this is I think it's important to point out that when we pursue endeavors that touch us personally, we find so much more value in life. We're more passionate when we let things touch us down to our core, to our heart. And that's really important to tell anybody, but really when you're talking to youth, encouraging them to let things lead them by their passions, because they'll feel so much more fulfillment in life when you do that. My wife is a scientist as well, Jennifer, and I'd like to introduce us as parents. Jennifer and I had a beautiful baby girl, Avielle, in 2006. the most amazing spirit. This kid can light up a room with a smile. It's infectious. You can't help but smile and laugh when you see it. She loved stories and really valued the ability to tell a story and studied it and loved telling stories. She needed stories to fall asleep, driving in the car, going to the bathroom, wherever she was. Tell me a story. Read me a story. Let's talk about it. And she, at a very young age, at 6 years old, recognized that her life is a story and that the most mundane thing, with a perspective that this is part of a chapter, this is part of a story, I want people to read it, I want people to engage in it, suddenly changes the view of what you're doing, and it can make it more joyful. Unfortunately, her story ends very short and tragically when she was murdered in her first grade classroom with 19 of her friends and classmates and 6 of her educators on a very dark Friday, December 14th of 2012 in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings in Newtown, Connecticut. And as you can imagine, very few things can touch you so viscerally, so profoundly. And Jen and my world was turned upside down. We were literally on the floor so that we didn't spin off the world. It just felt like there was nothing to hold on to. And immediately felt entirely compelled that we had to do something. We recognized that we have a problem of violence, and we need to do something to stop it. So we started traveling around the country, talking to people about our ideas, how we were going to respond, what we were going to do. And people would express to us the concept, they'd close their eyes and touch their face and say, I can't imagine what you're going through. I can't imagine that kind of loss. And while we, of course, appreciate the sentiment, it comes from the good place. The irony is that when you close your eyes and you do that, you are imagining it. And we need to imagine it, because until you let something touch you, until you walk a few steps in those shoes, you're not going to do anything about it. And we've spent too long reacting to things and not doing anything to prevent them. We said, not only can you imagine it, but we're obligated to. We have to imagine it. We have to put ourselves in those shoes, walk around for a little while, or nothing changes. So we have the trademark, you can imagine. And on the bright end of that tunnel, it's the imagination that we use to paint our world, beautiful colors. It's the imagination that sets us free to make tomorrow better than today. There's a great quote by A.J. Heschel, few are guilty, but all are responsible. And we're all responsible for our behaviors, the behaviors of our loved ones, and our communities that we live in. So we have to imagine it. And we have, unfortunately, a lot to imagine. It's a strange, surreal experience to be flying here on the 15th anniversary of September 11th. Here I am in an airplane where 2,996 people died in a violent tragedy. There's a lot of people that the ripple from that is profound, that directly were impacted. I'm presenting to you today on September 12th, what should have been Ben Wheeler's 10th birthday. There's Avielle with her friend Ben. He died in the classroom next door. There's another family that really can imagine it directly. But if you think about it, everybody that you talk to, every pair of eyes you look into, there's tragedy in everybody's hearts. There's adversity that everybody faces. And we have to remember that when we're stressed out at that jerk boss that we have, or that guy cuts you off in traffic. You have to think to yourself, there's a storm raging in them. They're fighting a battle too. They're just not wearing a uniform. But everybody is facing something. A great quote by Reverend Watson, be kind. Everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Remember that. It's an important concept. But we have a problem in our country, and we have to face it. We have a violent epidemic. And when I talk violence, I'm not talking about the sensationalized acts that we see, unfortunately all too often on our televisions that take place, in Florida, Virginia Tech, Oklahoma, We're talking about our street corners and our homes, violence to self and others every day. While the time that we're going to be sitting in here, 2 kids are going to be killed in our country. Every 6.5 minutes, somebody's raped in our country. 1 in 5 of you are going to be victimized violently this year. That's unacceptable. And we react to violence in our country because it's so common. We've become skilled at reacting to it. We are shocked when I tell people we spend over 1/3 of our federal budget responding to violence, primarily with incarceration. We don't spend a fraction of that. You couldn't even graph it on the same pie chart, how much we spend researching and studying how to prevent it. Where does it come from? We need to change that. So what is violence? If we look at the definition of violence, I often poll audiences, but I want to be really succinct today, so I'm just going to give it to you. Violence is the intentional use of force or power, threatened or actual, against an individual, a group, or community at large that has a likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or neglect. Again, here's that pie chart I was just talking about. We spend a lot of money reacting to it, but we don't spend any time preventing it. And so when Jennifer and I were faced with this, we wanted to play to our strengths as scientists, and we said, let's create a foundation that studies violence. What are the risk factors? What happens in that black box of the skull? And change that so we can build compassion, build connection, and kindness. So we created the Avielle Foundation in honor of our daughter, leaving a legacy for her with the mission to prevent violence and build compassion through neuroscience research, community engagement, and education. Specifically, we throw money through grants to study research of what happens in the brain, what are the chemical and structural changes that lead to violent behaviors. We do public health studies to look at what are the public health factors that lead to violence. We also have helped to start with the help of Marianne Liebert Publishing a scientific peer-reviewed journal called Violence and Gender, so that we have a voice for people that study violence. And we have a whole army of amazing young brains. They are our neuroscience interns that study with us, and they write and they do research in labs, and we're encouraging them and helping to facilitate their moving into this space. Because we need to make the study of the brain lucrative and prestigious so that we can fill these puzzle pieces in. But we also recognize that research in a vacuum for its own sake is really of no value unless you can give it to the everyday citizen in a way that they can embrace it. It's got to be straightforward and completely approachable, not intimidating, so that students, parents, teachers, healthcare providers, law enforcement, business leaders, the everyday person can use these tools to improve their lives and to increase connection and take action. So that's our mission, and that's what we're working towards. And we believe that when people have this education, it's not just power. Knowledge isn't just power. It's empowering. It's infectious. Once you're infected, you have no choice but to get involved and to take action, to change yourself or others. So we ask, well, what tools do we have in our toolbox? What do we use to study the brain? It's such an uncharted territory. What are we going to do? We got a big, long road ahead of us. We do have some amazingly powerful tools that we can use. We can look at the brain, and we can see the brain with amazing technology of magnetic resonance images. And not only that, but we can do it in a functional sense, so we can watch the brain as it's doing something. We can do the fluid chemistry, the pee in the cup science, where we can take some saliva or blood or urine and measure the components in that, doodle some stress hormones there. And we also have powerful genetic knowledge now. We know what all our genes are, and we can look at those genes and say, you know, what's different between this person's genes and that person's gene? We have this new science of epigenetics on top of genetics that studies how the environment shapes the expression of our genes. So these are some of the tools that we have at our disposal. Now what we need to do is use those tools to bridge the structural and biochemical science, the pee in the cup science, with the tell me about your mother behavioral science. To illustrate what I mean, to make that clearer, here on the left we have the structure of serotonin. It's one of our neurotransmitters. It's a chemical that you find in your brain that you make that we know if it's dysfunctionally signaling, is associated with feelings of overwhelming grief, sadness that we call depression. So we have a bridge between the biochemical, serotonin, and the behavior, depression. What we don't have is that piece of the puzzle that leads to a reactively violent individual who snaps and explodes inappropriately. It goes road rage on somebody. Or the kid in the lunch line who beats another kid up because he was disrespected. And what's the difference between the reactively violent individual and the proactive or instrumentally violent individual who's disenfranchised, separate from society, who pines away and contemplates ways to hurt in a violent sense, the serial killers and rapists? And what's the difference between their brains and the everyday citizen's brain? Excuse me. And on the other side of that equation, what is it that leads to somebody's, mindfulness or enlightenment, incredible acts of peace and compassion? What happens in that brain that leads to that? That's what we need to fill in. But unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers to this right now. The biggest barrier is the mental barrier. Right now, we diagnose diseases of the brain based on symptoms or groups of symptoms that we call syndromes. With experts, a checklist and survey and opinion. And it oftentimes defines the individual. Can you imagine going to the doctor and she looks at you and she says, well, your nose is running, your eyes are puffy, your throat is scratchy, you're a cold. That'd be ridiculous, right? But if you go to the doctor feeling depressed, sadness, overwhelming grief, and you answer yes to 5 out of 9 questions on a questionnaire, you're depressed. There's 2 problems with this. First of which is, no shit, I'm depressed, that's why I came in here, What I want is a reason for it. I need to have a pathology. You need to identify something that's wrong so I have the hope that it can be right again. And the other thing is, if you went in the doctor with a bone sticking out, they wouldn't say, you're a broken radius. You're prostate cancer. But you do get labeled, you are schizophrenic, you are bipolar, your child is ADD. I guarantee if you tell a kid that they're hyperactive, they're going to be hyperactive. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need to get away from the labels. We need to make the invisible world of mental the visible world of brain. Call it what it is. It is just another organ. While it is complex, it's not complicated. We know that these behaviors come from there. We need to give people hope, and instead of labeling them and causing the fear, trepidation, and the big S word, stigma, associated with this, it's a character judgment. We need to let people know it's chemistry, it's structure, and that, yes, you are responsible for that chemistry and structure, but it is changeable. We need to move. Can you imagine going to the doctor and now she says, little Johnny, he's right in the middle of the growth curve. Good job keeping him outside and more active than before. But we do find too much dopamine in his right cingulate cortex, which is a really fancy way of saying this completely explains his impulse control problems at school. Here's what we're going to do. We want you to work on this for the next few weeks. Maybe take a medication, maybe whatever the therapy becomes. That gives a parent hope. That gives no character flaw. Their child isn't broken. They're not bad parents. You're not telling them to read another self-help book. Then they're encouraged to get help for themselves and their loved ones without fear of discrimination and stigma. That's brain health. So I want you all to leave here tonight with a whole new lexicon. Take mental out of it entirely. Just replace it with brain. Change your braintality. Okay? But if we don't know what's going on in there, is there anything that we can do? What can we do today? Research takes forever. I can't wait. I need to prevent something from happening. Well, while the brain is a black box in there, we do know that if you input some of these risk factors, you're likely to get violent and aggressive behavior out. If you have a broken family unit, one that's abusive, sexually abusive, physically abusive, neglectful, if you don't have a supportive social or peer group, or if it's hostile, the environment that you live in, if there's substance abuse involved, if you have access to firearms, no matter how contentious the debate is, scientific fact, it increases your risk of self or other violence. Toxins in your environment. Nutrition matters. Physical trauma to the brain. We see a lot of this in the lay press with Will Smith's movie Concussion. Fantastic. The whole problems that we have right now in the military population, in the NFL population with traumatic brain injury. Violent media is a risk factor. And infection and inflammation. These are all risk factors that lead to increased tendency for violent behavior. And on the other side, we have protective factors that lead away from violence towards the anti-violence. I don't know what else to call it besides compassion, kindness, connection, resilience. And normally I'd like to expand on each of these and talk about the scientific support for them, and we can do that after this, and I'd be glad to have any discussion on any of these subjects if you'd like. But I want to focus on a couple of them because I think they're really valuable for tonight. One is the nature-nurture component. Everybody says, well, is it how you were born? Are you resigned to your genes, or is it the environment that matters? When it comes to the nature-nurture debate, there's no debate. So when anybody asks you, do you think it's the genes or the environment, nature or nurture? I want you to very sarcastically say, of course it is. You can't separate nature and nurture. Your genes determine how you see the world, what's relevant, what gets filtered in and out. And the environment shapes what genes are expressed, what organs they're expressed in, how long they're expressed there, to what extent they're expressed there. You can't separate them. There's a great behaviorist named Don Hebb who has a quote, "What contributes more to the area of a rectangle, the length or the width?" You might have some skinny, short rectangles, and you might have some tall, skinny rectangles, but every disease and every behavior has a component of both. Most of them are going to be square. And because of that, we can really speculate, so if this individual was predisposed towards violence, what can we do? You know, well, we have control of the environment. And if that person was predisposed and raised in an abusive household, in a horrible environment that they live in with toxins, maybe physical trauma, they're going to likely end up a violent individual, psychopathic behaviors. But that same individual raised with protective factors that are nurturing and healthy could end up our Fortune 500 CEO, our world leaders. This is true and not science fiction, because our brains are plastic throughout our lives. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to adapt and change in response to our experiences. It occurs on a molecular level, it occurs on a cellular level. Contrary to what a lot of us were taught when we were kids, you're not born with a set number of brain cells that just go down with time. We're making new ones and reshaping the ones that we have all the time. You're doing it right now, some of us more than others. And it occurs on a whole regional basis, like a muscle. The more you use it, the more effective it's usable. The less you use, it gets taken away. I'm going to skip through some of these statistics, but when you're born, you have about 100 billion neurons in your head. That's a large number. But even cooler is each of those neurons has the ability to communicate with over 2,500 other neurons, which in turn all communicate with another 2,500 neurons. It's an amazingly elaborate network of communication going on. But it gets even awesomer, because when you reach the age of, say, 3 all the way up through adolescence, which contrary to what we think is not 18, it's somewhere for girls in their early 20s, for boys a little bit later than that, your brain is primed for communication, for learning, for developing. 15,000 other cells every single neuron talks to through a synapse. That's amazing. That's a machine that we can't fathom. As you become an adult, you're not becoming stupid by losing those synaptic connections. It's called pruning, and it's how you become your unique individual that you are. You lose the connections that you didn't use, and you strengthen the ones that you did so they fire more effectively, and that's how we become ourselves. With that in mind, I love the quote by the ex-slave Frederick Douglass. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken adults. So while you can teach an old dog new tricks, it certainly makes a lot more sense just to raise a child without the bad habits in the beginning. We'll skip the cool brain connections. it's really easy to look at those risk factors and kind of start to cross them off and say, you know what, I'm good to go. I don't have, I have a healthy family, they eat good, I make sure they wear their helmets when they ride their bikes and play football well. They're not exposed to violent media that often. I'm good to go. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Like a muscle, which is either growing stronger and hypertrophying or weaker and atrophying, there is no balance point. It's always in flux. Our brain is that way too. If you're not actively pursuing protective factors, you are moving downhill towards more aggression and violence. That's just the way it is. So if we look at this protective factor side here and we ask ourselves, what can I work on today? What can I build? I really want to highlight self-mastery and emotional intelligence. This self-mastery is an incrementally derived skill set that involves the ability to set and achieve goals, to delay gratification, to identify, to name and tame your emotions, to recognize that your behavior affects the emotions of other people so that you need to use that and to make informed choices. And you can build these skills. They can be taught. They can be taught in an academic sense. This is so important that it's starting to become a real buzzword, right? It's so important that when the governor commissioned the Sandy Hook advisory report following the Sandy Hook murders, they came to one critical conclusion. And that was that social emotional learning must form an integral part of our curriculum from preschool through high school. And a lot of parents say, well, gosh, I want my kids to learn reading, writing, and math. Well, how are we going to spend all this time on this kind of tree-huggy, granola crunchy stuff? Well, I got news for you. It comes by many different names. It's popular now. It's SEL, social emotional learning. 21st century skills makes it cool for the business leader, right? Self-mastery, grit. We don't like that term anymore, so we use different ones. Whatever you call it, it turns out if you build this into the academic curriculum, your kids do better on their test scores. So you're good to go. They improve profoundly. And while we're at it, what do those academic test scores predict in terms of success for your children? Well, of course, if your kid's going to be a physicist, they need to know some math. If they're going to be a biologist, they need to know some biology. But when we look at what they predict in terms of their success, there's no predictive power. What it does tell us is almost disturbing to me. The better you do on reading, writing, or math worldwide, the more money your family has at the time you took the test. I don't think that's what we're trying to predict. On the other hand, emotional intelligence, self-mastery, self-discipline predicts success in life. Whether you define success as health, wealth, or happiness, your emotional intelligence from low to high predicts your likelihood of being incarcerated. It predicts your liability of abusing substances, alcohol or drugs. It predicts how often you're going to see the doctor. Can you imagine that? I love this one. It predicts your credit score. It predicts how much money you make as an adult. It predicts your parenting skills. And it predicts your overall satisfaction, your perception of how happy you are with life. So of all the things that we should be teaching our kids, it should be emotional intelligence, self-mastery, character building, the ability to define yourself and delay gratification, create values, and stick to them. Here's another example, I'll be really quick, of how this could be applied in sort of a socially valuable way. In Wisconsin, in the southeast portion near Madison, they had a lot of violence, particularly juvenile violence. And we're not talking petty theft, we're talking juvenile rape, homicide, and aggravated assault. To the point that they said, we can't afford this. We obviously can't afford this on a philosophical and moral level, but we literally can't afford this because each of those beds costs for the juveniles around $65,000 in the typical correctional juvenile processing system, where we have what's called a compression model led by law enforcement, where kids that infract lose rights and privileges, and if they continue to infract, lose them until they're in complete isolation, which does nothing to correct them. This is clear by the fact that if you let them out after time served and you follow them for 5 years, over 70% of them recommit another rape, murder, or aggravated assault. 70%. Now they're lifers. Now we're not paying 65 grand for a bed, we're paying in the $80,000 range. Out of your pockets, we're paying for this. There's no corrections involved. And so in this area, they said, let's do an experiment. We've got nothing to lose and a lot to gain. Let's change the model around from compression to decompression. And they went to the Mendota Hospital, led by healthcare providers. Of course, there's still law enforcement and security there, because these are dangerous kids. But they're given individual attention. They're given cognitive behavioral therapy. And I would argue, and my therapy friends forgive me, I would argue it's not the CBT that matters, it's just individual attention that matters. They're taught that their lives matter and that their actions have consequences that affect other lives in a profound way. This had such a dramatic effect that after only 2 years of instituting this model and following the kids for another 5 years, they cut recidivism in half. That's a model that we can afford. And we need to do more of these studies. We need to expand it to a larger data set to see if it still holds water in a scientific sense, and to see if we can apply it to adults, to the adult population. That would be true corrections. Why do I think that this happens? Why are these risk factors, and protective factors protective? What makes them work? If you look at the human brain as we evolved over time, it's not bigger brains that we got. It's the specialized part of our brain called the neocortex. It's the ratio of the neocortex to the whole brain volume that makes us unique. And if we look at what that correlates with, it correlates really well with the size of group that we live in. So I'm not sure if we have big neocortexes because we live in large groups, or we live in large groups because we have a big neocortex. But regardless, we've evolved to live in large communal settings. And when we talk about evolution, we don't play by the same rules anymore, and we need to recognize that. Here we have Darwin's finches. This finch in the upper left, number 1, has a big, fat, meaty beak because in its environment, it had to adapt to survive by crunching tough nuts and seeds. And if it didn't, it went extinct. It had to adapt. The one in the lower right, number 4, that finch's environment had a carbohydrate-rich environment where they needed to get their beaks into the flowers to get to the nutrients inside. If it didn't adapt, genetically evolve, it died off. But humans don't work like that. If we want to crack a nut, we build a nutcracker. If we're cold, we make jackets. Heck, we went to the moon just to check it out. We're very adaptable. We suit our environment to fit us. And I argue it's not the genetics that make us adaptable. It's what Richard Dawkins calls the memetics. It's the sharing of knowledge that matters. It's the sharing of our stories, our individual dialogues, our thoughts, our ideas, our creations with each other that allows us to evolve. And it's those that can communicate, connect, collaborate, and create that are the evolved individuals. And that innate, unique ability to humans is what makes us human. So ironically, it's the ability to be humane that makes us human. Again, we're fraught with contrived, barriers all the time. If you look around the world, it turns out people are shocked when I say that there's no such thing as race. There's only the human race. This is a fact. These 2 girls in Nigeria are just as genetically similar as these 2 in Southern California. In fact, Avielle on the bottom right could be more similar to a girl in the top right than to Sophie it's just a fact. So am I saying that when you get your college entrance application or your job application, what race do you identify with, to cross it off and say, hey, I'm a human? Well, yes, that's true. Unfortunately, while there is no such thing as race, there is, unfortunately, all the isms. All the things that we contrive. Racism. And until those are normalized, we can't evolve. Until we take those barriers down, we can't live to our potential. So we really need to imagine being humane in order to be the evolved humans that we are. That's how we'll prevent violence and build compassion. So before I go, I always promise my wife I won't forget this stuff. I would really appreciate if you guys would go online, find the AvielleFoundation.org and donate, because we need your funds to do the research and the education that we're doing. If you shop on Amazon, hey, it's easy. Go to smile.amazon.com and they'll ask you what charity you want to support. It doesn't cost you anything, and Amazon donates a portion of your purchase. Like us, follow us, tweet us, and share us. It matters. It not only matters because it gives us exposure, but it matters because when people are talking about brain health in a comfortable and transparent way, suddenly the barriers will be broken down. People will take into their brain health into their own hands, into their lives. They'll embrace it without fear and trepidation. And I thank you for all your time. I hope I didn't go way too far over.
We've got some time for questions, and first question right up here. No, wait a minute, we gotta wait for the microphone.
Oh.
I heard you started with your daughter, the loss of her physically. We know now that I can be on a plane, I can be on a ship, I could be any place, and there can be a 6-week-old baby almost that knows how to take that cell phone, that photo, and start without you teaching them how to use it. I believe that's capital, human capital, that we have not used. Does any of your research tell you how to take that human capital when all of them have a piece of digital in their hand, that they can be the tutors?
That's a very insightful question, and yes, when we talk about violent media being a problem, here's an experiment. When I say violent media is a risk factor that leads to increased violence, what violent media do you think I'm talking about? Movies. All right. Movies, that's great. Most people think video games. When we think about the fact that television is so pervasive, it's on all the time, it turns out that since the 60s, they've done research all the way up till just last week, you can find papers that clearly correlate violent media with acts of violence and increased aggression, so much so that 2 of our Surgeon Generals, Satcher and Koop, issued Surgeon General warnings against violent television. But we don't do anything about that. And now you take that into account that television is totally passive, right? It's sit back, relax, be entertained. And our video games now are so immersive, oftentimes first person, so you're seeing the game through the eyes of, as if you were in the game. And it's real time, so you're punished for the wrongdoings immediately. You're reinforced and punished immediately, very effective. And you take that into account with the fact that 25% of the video games, just by their nature, are purely violent. Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. And that the other 75% throw in some component of violence almost always. You take the most innocent game like Minecraft, now you have Minecraft Hunger Games. When you take all that into account, you say, wow, we need to get rid of video games. But you're not going to get rid of it. That's totally naive. And you have, as you pointed out, such an amazing tool, such a great platform to educate through. These violent video games make around $1.3 billion. And that purchase power is profound, and that's our purchase power. We're the ones that's spending the money on it. If we say, EA Games, we don't want that, we want this, they're happy to make it for you. So we need to support educational and clever character building apps in games so that our kids engage in it, which they naturally do anyway. 95% of our adolescents play video games and engage with these electronic devices we can demand that it be made, and it will be one of the most effective training tools, right?
Yes, you have a question right here.
I'm interested in what you talked about because I've studied neurotheology and neuroeconomics and read about them. The question I have is dealing with neuroplasticity. How does the violent games and television impact that? And then in your systems with juveniles and adults who repeat violent offenders, how can neuroplasticity help mitigate against future violence?
Those are the pieces of the puzzle that are still missing, and those are the type of research studies that we're trying to fund. So the unsatisfying answer is we don't know. We don't know what the video games do. We don't know what, what are the consequences, the physical manifestations of being abused. What is changed yet about the incarcerated individual? What we do know is that their brains are plastic. We know that much of what has been done can be undone. We don't know what it is, though, or how to fix it. So it's just not that satisfying. But
Yes, sir.
You got to start somewhere.
Here comes the microphone to you.
Over the last 6 years, I've been keeping track of previews at the theater or on a DVD. 70% of them are violent. That doesn't mean that my research is any good,
Sure.
Would you tell the group about Dr. Daniel Amin, because they may want to read him?
You'll have to educate me. I'm not familiar with the name just up front.
His father said he doesn't know.
Okay. Dr. Amin was a psychiatrist, and he said, why don't we study the brain like you've been doing? And everything you talk about is in his books. AMEN, if anybody wants to read. But he's doing the research that you're doing.
He's funding it, or he's performing the research itself?
Performing the research.
Okay, great, I'll check it out.
Any other questions? Yes, we got one right here. I'll give you this. Oh, you got it coming right there.
So you spoke a little bit about explaining to parents about mental health. Your child has a, low amount of dopamine in their brain, instead of saying your kid is depressed. So as far as, working with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or, psychiatrist to psychiatrist, how would you change that, the lingo between an institution or, how would a drug company change their lingo? Do you think that would have to be kind of a systematic overhaul?
I do. I mean, can you imagine I go to the Health and Human Services and I talk to them about this, and they like the idea. They love the idea of brain health and changing it from mental to brain. But, you go to SAMHSA and you say, can you call it SABSA, the Substance Abuse and Brain Health Disorders Administration? And they say, oh yeah, sure, but that would be a lot of letterhead we got to change. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't want to be flippant and say we have to change the terminology. It's just a word. But it's more than that. It's the whole mindset. It's how you think about it. And so, yeah, I mean, I worked at pharmaceutical companies for decades, and drug discovery was what I was into. They would have absolutely no problem. I mean, they all get it. They recognize it's brain health. It's the brain that they study. It's the brain that they're drugging. Psychiatrists, I don't think would have any problem with it either. They would love to have the ability to diagnose a disease outside of a checklist and opinion. So there's no hesitation on the part of the medical field in any way. I went and talked to at the time Tom Insel, who's left. He got recruited by Google, which is awesome. But he was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, and he said this entirely. He said, I want to move away from the DSM-5 based diagnosis of brain illnesses and call them brain illnesses and study this. He totally gets it. The knee-jerk concern, though, and it's a really important one, is that people don't begin to discriminate and say people with mental illnesses are violent. We don't want that. We don't want that perception. But you do away with that with brain illnesses. I'm not saying that somebody that has psychoses, delusions, and hallucinations and might suffer with schizophrenia, that they're more violent to themselves or others, even though they might be. I'm saying that whatever the pathology is that leads to those delusions and hallucinations can increase the risk of violence. And that, I think, takes away a lot of the fear and the interpretation. When you don't know why somebody's acting really weird and really crazy, then you're scared. You know, if you're on the Stairmaster and the buddy next to you says, oh, you know, I need to go take my medication, my cholesterol's out the roof, you know, that's why I'm working out, I got to eat better. You're like, oh, I hear you, that stinks. But if that person's like, oh, I got to go take my medication, I'm hearing voices again, I have these psychotic episodes, you're going to be like, are they talking to you right now? You know? So that's a problem, but we need to realize it's just, it's not a character flaw, it's a chemical flaw.
Well, let me say, Jeremy, I want to thank you very much, number one, for your work and what you're doing, and secondly, for speaking up. You, in essence, are a great profile and courage, and we thank you very much for coming to the Clinton School, and I'm going to thank Clinton School alum Chad Williamson, who was instrumental in bringing you here. So let's give Jeremy Richman a round of applause.